Thank you very much for the kind invitation to join you today. I'm going to be talking about human adaptation to invasive species. And this, in part, is based on a publication on the same topic, which was done through a meta-analysis of case studies from across the globe, about 70. That was published, as you can see here, in Ambio in 2019. My presentation is going to be as follows. The first question is, why discuss human adaptation to invasive species at all? Why consider it? The second is, what is adaptation to invasives and who are the adapters? Next, I'm going to address how we understand adaptation processes and what they entail. And finally, I'm going to briefly touch on approaches for incorporating adaptation into invasive species governance. I'll be referring throughout to a case study on Prosopis juliflora invasion in the Afar of Ethiopia. Prosopis juliflora is one of is a very widely distributed invasive species with a lot of impacts. And the case study in Afar, Ethiopia is probably the best documented in the world in relationship to the human impacts, ecological, and to processes of adaptation I'll be discussing. The Afar has been occupied by the Afar pastoralist peoples that are nomadic herders of mainly cattle, but more recently camels. It's an ancient culture, very sophisticated, based on tremendous local ecological knowledge, and where milk is probably the most culturally significant product of livestock. But with the juliflora invasion, there has been a major upheaval in the socio-ecological system of the Afar and for the Afar people themselves. Okay, first I'd like to discuss the question of established invaders. When should we consider adaptation as a response? There are environmental reasons for this. For example, oceans, where there are tremendous connectivity, where invasives are very, very difficult to control. And many people have said that we should just forget about it, just give up on that, like lionfish in the Caribbean. There are also invasive traits, such as very high propagule pressure, a very great capacity to disperse of a particular species. And then there's the question of the scale of invasion, such as in the United States in the Great Plains with cheatgrass, or with Lantana camara, which has invaded a very large area of forests in the Western Ghats in India. There are also management reasons. For example, management control methods are basically ineffective. We haven't found any that work. Or non-target effects are high. Control can be unaffordable, simply. And it can also be socially unacceptable. For example, culling of animals is often found to be unacceptable. But also people can resist the use of chemicals, as in this case. In the case of biocontrol with the tamarisk leaf beetle in the United States, denuding the tamarisk tree actually is endangered, further endangered an already endangered species, the willow flycatcher. So that release of the biocontrol agent was stopped legally in the United States. There's also socioeconomic reasons for considering adaptation. One is of species that are ecologically harmful but economically or socially beneficial, such as the case with the Nile perch in Lake Victoria in Kenya, which has become a major export industry. Acacia species have been incorporated into agroforestry systems over much of the tropical and subtropical world and provide a great many ecosystem services for people. Chromoleana odorata, a major invasive across much of the globe, is beneficial when it's incorporated in the swidden fallows because it conditions soil and improves soil nutrients as well as suppresses other worse invasives. However, when it invades rangelands, it's unpalatable. It can make those virtually unuseful for livestock. King crab in Norway is another case of an invasive that has been economically incorporated. And then also we have the situation where invasive species become culturally important, even insofar as they become cultural keystone species, such as wild horses and Native Americans in Canada. But beyond these cases, when must human adaptation be considered? When invasives impact human well-being anywhere, people will attempt to manage them. Or if they cannot manage them to reduce those impacts to minimize the impacts, then they will have to adapt to the impacts. And very often they need to do both. These are some cases of means by which people attempt to adapt or reduce the impacts of invasives, such as the biocontrol, using ducks for biocontrol of golden apple snails in Thailand, where it also serves as a feed, or making baskets from Lantana camara in the Western Ghats. In Costa Rica, people have been selecting their own pathogen-resistant local cultivars of cacao, but also in Papua New Guinea with Piper aduncum invasion, entire agricultural systems have changed. And in the Afar, people have had to resettle to actually move their places where they live with the invasion of Prosopis, which they haven't been able to control. The private sector also will need to adapt when production and profits are affected. The control of mussels, livestock pest control, aquacultural pathogens, aquatic weeds, greenhouse biocontrol. And in Australia, for example, it shows the use of pesticides and insecticides and herbicides over time, and these only continue to increase. There's also adaptation in the form of learning to live with or profit from invasive species, as is the case even with governments that have decided to take this approach. For example, increasingly around Lake Victoria, there is water hyacinth is being turned into biogas. And in India, also, the use of Prosopis juliflora for biofuels has been going on for decades and has very strong government intervention and backing. This is a case where Arundel the wild giant reed, is being promoted privately by private industries as biomass, biogas, bioethanol, bioremediation, even paper and forage. But we're not sure that it's a very good idea to go around planting Arundel. There would be a lot of objections for this. So there's a lot of risk that can be entailed when it comes to using invasive species, adapting to them, using them. But that will be quite species and context specific. So what is adaptation and who adapts? Let's start with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They defined in 2008 two types of adaptation to climate change: planned, which is the result of deliberate policy decisions based on an awareness that conditions have changed or are about to change, and then actions required to maintain or achieve a desired state. But they have a second category, autonomous adaptation, which is adaptation that does not constitute a conscious response to climatic stimuli, but is triggered by ecological changes in natural systems and by market or welfare changes in human systems. The questions about autonomous adaptation is it always unintentional, or can it be purposeful? Is it always reactive, or can it be proactive? And is it independent of outside influence? We've decided that another concept is necessary, and it's called autochthonous adaptation. Just like in biology, autochthonous refers to origins, to something that is native to a place. And it's defined as such: deliberate adaptation actions undertaken by individuals or small social groups that are specific to and occur within a local system where human populations are ultimately affected. So it's deliberate. It involves individuals and small groups of individuals and other non-state actors like companies, enterprises. It's specific to a locality where specific environmental, economic, social, and cultural conditions prevail, where people live, work, and act. And it occurs within a local system, and the system is affected by drivers and feedbacks at multiple scales. So it is influenced by outside or exogenous forces. There is a relationship we found between planned and autochthonous adaptation. And this gives you an idea of what types of relationships around invasive species. So at higher scales, there are drivers, exogenous drivers. These can be global, these can be national or regional. There are management efforts, global, national, etc., and there's governance at global, national, regional levels. But at local levels, where you're talking about autochthonous adaptation, there are also local drivers, and they interact, of course, with these higher scale drivers or are influenced by them. There are management and adaptation actions, and those interact possibly with actions at a higher level, and the same with governance. And these affect local environmental conditions, local ecological systems, and local human and social and economic systems. How common is autochthonous adaptation to invasives? What we found, and these are still hypotheses, but the evidence is growing, is that across the globe, invasions that directly impact people are managed only at local scales without government intervention or regulation. Then most plan control efforts are implemented at least in part by non-state actors. And in many sectors, nearly exclusively non-state actors are implementing, which may be true, for example, in agriculture or in forestry. The efficacy of many planned control programs and regulations has also been limited. The private sector often plays a larger role than the government in promoting invasive control for profit. For example, agricultural input firms. And people must also autochthonously adapt to plan controls and regulations and their impacts. We've developed a conceptual framework for understanding processes of adaptation, and I've called them adaptation spheres. I'm going to be going through these, but the green ones are adaptation, are drivers of change and of adaptation. The center ones are invasive control and management. I'll go through these. And I'm not going to pay attention to the right-hand side for right now. As far as drivers go, there's three types of interacting drivers that I've identified. One, invasive species themselves are the drivers, invasive species and their spread. And that also, the invasibility of the local environment is the result of numerous interacting drivers, which biologists and ecologists like to call disturbances. These are economic, environmental, social, political, and technological drivers. But in addition to this, many of the drivers of invasion are at the same time drivers of human adaptation, because invasives have both impacts that are harmful and beneficial to people. So humans, that drives human adaptation. But human adaptation to invasives itself becomes a driver of further social and ecological change and adaptation. This shows something about cross-scale interactions in macro ecosystems. So we're talking about increasing scale, this is local level and higher level, and increasing complexity. I'm going to skip that slide. I'd like to look at the drivers of Prosopis juliflora invasion in the Afar of Ethiopia. The first thing that happened was that the state decided to establish large agro-industries with irrigation and irrigation infrastructure in the area. They took existing grazing land and they converted it to agriculture. Then they introduced Prosopis to provide fuel wood for state farm workers and also for environmental stabilization. But within a few decades, within a relatively short period of time, these state farms proved to be not profitable and they were abandoned. And at the same time they were abandoned, the irrigation infrastructure that had been created in what was basically a river basin was neglected. And when this happened, flooding occurred. Prosopis juliflora is water dispersed, and it was dispersed into cropland as well as taking over a great deal of the grazing land. And it is, of course, unpalatable except for the seeds. But livestock do eat the seeds. Prosopis also resists drought. It has a very deep taproot and it's able to survive drought. And in the area is also subject to relatively frequent droughts. The livestock dispersed Prosopis, and pastoralists had to move their cattle further and further away to find grazing resources, where they not only ended up spreading Prosopis, but finding themselves in conflict with other pastoralists. Then we talk about the adaptation spheres. And there are three: invasive management, the adaptation of resource use and management systems, and the adaptation of household systems and enterprises. The first is invasive control and management, and virtually everywhere that invasives have an impact on people's well-being, they do attempt to manage or control it. Even when that impact is beneficial, they will attempt to manage it to increase populations of invasive species. Of course, there's all the different kinds of control: manual weeding, chemical control, management of shade, cultural management, that is mulching, grazing and browsing, and prescribed burning. People are also often obliged to adapt to planned control measures, government measures. So, for example, in the Afar, the government decided, because Prosopis cannot be controlled other than by conversion to agriculture, for example, and even then there's still problems with invasions, they decided to promote control through use and implemented, set up cooperatives for the production of charcoal. The problems ensued because many times the charcoal production was quite profitable, and people came in from outside of the region and began to organize the charcoal production, basically taking it over. And when they did that, there were a lot of social problems that became involved. For example, women were raped and even murdered in the area. Their clan or tribe heads began to be bribed, and these outsiders began to control a lot of the resources. But on top of that, they began to cut the native species for charcoal as well. And that became, given the threat of Prosopis juliflora, cutting down the native species led to very important biodiversity loss and loss of resources for local people. The second sphere of adaptation is adaptation in resource systems. And I'll just mention a few of these that have been found. For example, in settlements, human settlements and land use systems. This means changes in the way human populations are distributed, so people will actually migrate or they will resettle. They will increase or reduce the number of settlements. It can mean broad changes in land use, including land abandonment or urbanization. For example, in the United States, where some invasives have affected rangelands quite profoundly, people have been forced to give up their land and to sell it for development. Agricultural systems are often changed. People can move into agriculture or out of agriculture. It can mean changes in crops, in crop varieties, those that are more resistant to invasive species, to cropping systems, or in soil or fallow management systems. It can also affect changes in replacing missing biological resources, so that as some native species, for example, begin to diminish in populations, in abundance, etc., then people will substitute the missing resources with other local species, or very often substitute them where possible with the invasive species itself, or find substitutions for those missing resources through trade, purchase them. Some of the adaptations in these systems also lead to restoration. For example, this is bracken fern in Mexico. Bracken fern in the left-hand side has invaded, and what the indigenous population has learned to do is to interplant crops in bracken-dominated areas, and then after that start planting trees to shade out bracken. And they've successfully reclaimed some areas of bracken land. The Lackadan Maya also have learned to deal with bracken invasion in forests by planting balsa. And balsa effectively shades out bracken and allows forest succession to occur. There's also many occasions when people have learned to turn harmful impacts into benefits. And there are different ways that this is done. For example, in Cameroon, Imparata cylindrica invaded people's Swidden agricultural systems, to the point where crops could only be produced with great difficulty and great investments of labor. So people decided to convert these areas into agroforestry systems, planting cocoa and palm, and then interplanting their crops in between. And the result was much higher levels of production per hectare, 67 different species of trees growing in these areas, so an increase in the biodiversity and an increase, of course, in the useful products that people gained. So human well-being and ecosystems were much improved. In Lake Inle in Myanmar, water hyacinths have been used to create a substrate for gardens that float in the lake. And then these gardens have been used for intensive agriculture. In India, Prosopis juliflora has also been used for biofuel. The impacts have not been as negative necessarily as in Ethiopia, but it's done on a much broader scale. To understand adaptation and how it affects households and how it affects enterprises, you need to look at it as a process, as you do in industry, of input, process and output feedbacks. Inputs include labor, technology, equipment, materials, capital, knowledge, etc. Processes entail the organization of work, of procedures, as well as biological, chemical, and physical processes that occur in the production, for example, in agriculture. And the outputs are financial, in terms of goods and ecosystem services, in terms of human health, in terms of well-being. And there are feedbacks in these processes. For example, the financial outputs and the outputs of goods can turn around and can be converted into inputs and conditions for production. Households have also had to adapt because of the need for invasive management and control and the need to change their production systems. For example, to control the golden apple snail, children have been taken out of school. In Thailand, to manage Opuntia ficus indica and perhaps use it as livestock fodder, there's an increase in the amount of women's unpaid labor. And women have to then give up other activities. There's increasing expenditures on inputs for control, such as sprayers and chemicals. In fishing, there can be changes in fishing targets, in the processes of fishing, and in the technology used. With Prosopis juliflora in Kenya, pastoralists have shifted from grazers that are heavily impacted by Prosopis to browsers, which are less impacted. But the process of shifting from grazers to browsers has taken more than 2 decades. And of course, as in this case in the invasive vine, sometimes it's forced entire change in land use, which has multiple input-output process repercussions. So household adaptations, and we can extend this as well to enterprises, include change in labor demand, in the organization of labor, and in labor processes, which can affect the entire household or the entire enterprise, possibly all of the activities. Then direct investments in invasive control and in the adaptation of production systems. This affects the availability of capital for all activities and for consumption or reinvestment. There's a change in the demand for knowledge, new knowledge, the utility of existing knowledge, and access to new knowledge and skills has to be secured. And then there's changes in the outputs of production, which affect income, assets, and human well-being. People also develop adaptation strategies. These aren't individual actions, but they're series of actions. And I'll talk about just a few of these to give you an idea. For example, mobility. Mobility can mean tracking resources when they move. So if fish can only be found in other places, people will go after fish in those places, or fodder, or water. So people will actually track the resources in space and time. Migration. So you may have to temporarily or permanently out-migrate to track resources or to find alternative livelihoods if your livelihoods are no longer viable. And then, of course, people may have to resettle, and pastoralists may have to sedentarize. Diversification is the second one. There's ecological diversification, which means using more different ecological niches than previously. So finding additional plots of land or finding additional areas in which you can forage for wild resources. More ways to subsist, going from only agriculture to agricultural and livestock, or diversifying into fishing, moving into wage labor, or developing new enterprises, for example, those that might be based on invasive species such as charcoal. Human adaptations have ecological, economic, and social feedbacks. Adaptation can change drivers. They can change invasive dynamics. This is the point of management to a certain degree. It can change the impacts of invasives. It can turn harms into benefits, for example. And adaptation and feedbacks can overall make whole social ecological systems more or less resilient to change. Adaptation and feedbacks can also lead to regime shift or tipping points and transformation. But the intentions of most actors are to increase their own resilience or the resilience of their systems, or in fact to transform systems that are no longer functioning. This is again the afar situation. And if we look and focus in on the area in the oval, the way that people have adapted in part is first they adapted by overstocking livestock on the land, but that increased the amount of herd loss, that decreased grazing resources. So those feedbacks were very negative. And on the other hand, some of them moved into agriculture and began to sedentarize because of these herd losses. But as well, these herd losses provoked further nomadism, tracking resources, moving out of the area to try to find grazing resources. It also led to increasing conflict. People on the right-hand side began to resettle. They went into petty trade, into low-paid wage labor, and they began to immigrate. The outcomes, however, have been, in general, impoverishment and malnourishment, greater social conflict, and traditional institutions have been undermined. In the process, the whole system, many would say, has gone into collapse. Adaptation needs to be seen as a product of several, possibly multiple social groups who have different adaptation strategies and therefore are over time and space. And we can consider those as alternate pathways of adaptation. These pathways of adaptation are here shown by arrows, different colored arrows, and they have feedbacks. So different groups' adaptation efforts feed back in positive or negative ways to other groups' adaptation efforts, both in terms of ecological change, in terms of social economic change. There's an area in the middle which is considered to be a space within people can be flexible and adapt, and it maintains or more or less the stability of the system. But there are also the possibility that you go across thresholds, and this tips the whole system into an alternate state. For example, the conflict that's been encountered in the afar can also tip the entire social system and push it over a brink. Here are examples of the case studies in terms of the overall dynamics of adaptation of different groups of people. If you look at the first one, the golden apple snail in Ecuador, which has invaded a lot of intensive agriculture, and a lot of pesticides are used by farmers, and this causes collateral damage. And the collateral damage means increasing pests and diseases in agriculture. But also the pesticides are harming the native snail kite, a bird that is preys upon the golden apple snail. And all of these things are possibly increasing invasion over time. So on the right, you see that instability, both ecological in terms of human well-being, are increased by this adaptation. Another example is the Australian acacia used in agroforestry systems in India and in the Congo, where farmers' management of acacia and bringing it into fallows has increased biodiversity. It's increased the number of useful species. It's increased income and well-being. So the resilience of the agricultural systems has been improved. They're more stable in terms of ecosystem services and human well-being. Another case is in Nepal with Mecania micranthra. In Nepal, people are very dependent on wild resources for their well-being. The World Wildlife Federation introduced biogas stoves that are based on dung, on livestock dung. And that was for the purpose of decreasing fuel wood demand so that people would use less of the forest resources. But this dung-based biogas stoves increased the demand for grass to feed livestock. People collect grass from areas that are invaded by Mecania, and Mecania has decreased the amount of forage grass. Therefore, people begin to travel further to collect grass. And when they do so, they spread Mecania further. So Mecania decreases both fuel wood and grass resources. And when that happens, it decreasing fuel wood increases the dependence on biogas. So again, we have increased instability in ecosystem services and human well-being. But this is a result in part of this is a result, as you can see, in part of adaptive strategies. Now I'd like to turn to a different topic, which is how we might understand and influence the outcomes of adaptation. If adaptation is this pervasive, then the question is how do we consider adaptation when we're trying to plan management of species or management of ecosystems, etc. Well, going back to this question about the relations between multiple actors who are adapting and the outcomes, we can think of it in terms of potential entergies between actors and their adaptation actions. For example, externalities. The actions of one actor are negatively affecting the conditions for another actor's actions. Or scale mismatches. The spatial and temporal scales of action of various actors are not in sync with each other, so the actions are less productive. Another is conflict. Conflict can arise from different interests in that process of adaptation, where some people may be wanting to use an invasive and others may be wanting to control an invasive spread. Also different perceptions, power, resources, and costs and benefits. Knowledge is also imperfectly distributed, and knowledge and perceptions may be conflicting, and the costs of knowledge are high for everyone. The question is, how could one potentially create synergies between adaptation actions? And that could be, for example, through ecosystem-based management. Here we're talking about both planned and autochthonous adaptation. Ecosystem-based management is most prevalent in the marine sector, and it recognizes coupled social ecological systems with stakeholders involved in an integrated and adaptive management process where decisions reflect societal choice. This is a poster that is been put out by Aquacross, which is a project, an EU project. And it gives the idea of what are the principles of ecosystem-based management. So one is that it's carried out at appropriate spatial scales. Another, that it builds on socio-ecological interactions, stakeholder participation, and transparencies. It uses adaptive management, and adaptive management means coming up with management actions and very carefully monitoring the implementation, the outcomes, and changing those as required to adjust to reality and new knowledge. It considers ecological integrity, biodiversity, resilience, and ecosystem services as goals. It develops and uses multidisciplinary knowledge, but further, knowledge of many different actors. So not only scientific knowledge, but as well local knowledge. and it supports the coordination of policy across scales. Stakeholder engagement is one of the fundamental requirements, that is, to bring in all of the relevant actors and agents in decisions, partnership, participation, etc., in communication. It also requires knowledge integration in agenda setting, in implementation, in an evaluation. This particular graph comes from One Health policy, but it is equally applicable to other kinds of ecosystem-based management. And it requires systems analysis. So you have to analyze the different social, ecological, and economic components, drivers, and pressures, etc., together, instead of separately as disparate entities. So invasive species would be put into the context of systems and understanding how these systems are functioning. What about the golden mussel? Well, I am very obviously, no expert on the golden mussel. I have had the opportunity to have some conversations, some personal communications with Boltowski and also with Ernesto Brugnoli from Uruguay. But I only have a very few points that might be put out for the purposes of discussion that I have learned. One is that private companies develop their own management strategies, generally speaking, without sharing information or collaborating with others. Then that all hydroelectric plants have adopted measures to cope. In many cases, according to Boltowski, they use the time-consuming cleaning of foul surfaces, but he argued that the engineers in charge of maintenance are reluctant to change routines. It's difficult to extrapolate impacts from one site to another, and the other is that the focus is on control rather than on ecosystem change and adaptation. There are many different stakeholders that are affected by the golden mussel or can be affected, including the nuclear power plants, including oil refineries, steel and iron production industries, tilapia aquaculture in Brazil, sturgeon aquaculture as well in Brazil and I think Uruguay. But there's also different stakeholders involved in the spread of invasive species. This is from Boltowski's 2015 book, and where it's showing the main dynamics of spread of the golden mussel. And then the recent publication by Brugnoli et al. For Uruguay is also adding the dredging and movement of sand, of course, fishing, recreational boaters, and aquaculture. But in addition to this, they have mentioned agro-industries, food, forestry, etc., that are entailed and potentially impacted. There's a possibility that new stakeholders could emerge because if the evidence is correct, Boltowski has reported some substantial increase in fish catches in areas where fish populations are increasing. And if people become invested in these increases in fish numbers and fish catches, they may benefit from the golden mussel and also insist on changes in management objectives. Okay. The last thing are simply a few takeaway questions that you might want to consider for discussion. The last is a few takeaway questions that you might want to consider for discussion. And that includes, for example, what forms of adaptation actions are being undertaken by adapters in response to these high levels of ecological change? What level of access do the users have to power over aquatic resources? How much can they control, is under their control? What other key assets do they have to enable their adaptation actions? What's the geographic scale of these adaptation behaviors and of the expected outcome? How dependent is the adaptation action that's being undertaken on any kind of cooperation, government cooperation, or cooperation with scientists? What are the expected outcomes of the adaptation behavior for different types of ecological vulnerability of the system and different levels of socioeconomic vulnerability of the affected aquatic users? What types of benefits are being generated? How can the observed adaptation behaviors potentially interact with planned government efforts? And what are the implications for further adaptation planning? I thank you very much for your great patience, and I hope I'm able to stimulate some thinking and discussion.